For the opposition.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the government House Leader's motion on this. But also, I would withdraw our late debate so that we don't run into that problem.
Is it agreed on the Honourable Government House Leader's motion? Is it agreed? It is agreed. And I would also make mention that the topic for late debate has already been submitted and therefore was included on the order paper, so the motion to withdraw is denied. So we'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, this government is not taking the doctor shortage seriously. Negotiations between the government and our provincial doctors have been going on for over a year, Mr. Speaker. During that time, many meetings and negotiations were cancelled or rescheduled by the government side, Mr. Speaker, by the Department of Health, because they always said they needed more time to prepare, and I will table that for the benefit of the House. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier today update the House on the status of the negotiations between Nova Scotia's doctors and the Government of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to thank all those who have been working on behalf of government and Doctors Nova Scotia to come to what is a fair and reasonable agreement, continuing to have that negotiation, continue to talk at the table, and we look forward to being able to communicate a positive result to the citizens of Nova Scotia in the not-too-distant future.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A CIHI report, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, shows that Nova Scotia was one of only 3 provinces and territories in the whole country that has not seen an increase in the number of doctors, Mr. Speaker. That is despite the Premier's promise in the last election that every Nova Scotia family would have a doctor. Mr. Speaker, when there is a doctor shortage in Nova Scotia, why is the Premier allowing us to fall behind other provinces who are seeing some success in recruiting new doctors?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about the fact that we've tore down the walls in the healthcare system, that the Health Authority, Mr. Speaker, is working across the province to ensure that we have a distribution of healthcare providers. All new family physicians, Mr. Healthcare providers have recognized the collaborative practice model is the one that's been working, the one that has healthcare providers come and stay in communities across the province. That model is rolling out. It's unfortunate it didn't roll out 5 years ago, Mr. Speaker, but we're in the process of working that, encouraged by the 10 new doctors that are going into Cape Breton. We're seeing signs of a possibility of doctors going in other communities. We're going to continue to work with our healthcare providers to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotians get access to primary health care in the community they live in.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia Health Authority confirms that the collaborative model the Premier talks about is 5 to 10 years away. In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotia families, thousands of them, are going without a doctor. Mr. Speaker, it is unimaginable that the government would not be out recruiting new doctors while talking about something that's 5 to 10 years into the future. Mr. Speaker, people need doctors now. They were promised doctors now, Mr. Speaker, but every day that goes by, another doctor retires. In fact, Doctors Nova Scotia says that 800 to 900 doctors are scheduled to retire in the next 10 years, Mr. Speaker, but I guess we're all supposed to wait. Meanwhile, the negotiations drag on and on with the Department of Health not able to get to the table in a timely way and conclude an agreement. Mr. Speaker, why is the government dragging its feet on negotiations with doctors when there is such an urgent family need?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. He has a number of mistakes in the question, Mr. Speaker. We're not waiting 5 years for collaborative practice. If he actually moved around the province, Mr. Speaker, he'd recognize collaborative practices are being built now across the province. We've seen healthcare teams working in communities in collaborative practice models. So to suggest it's 5 years away, Mr. Speaker, is simply misleading and trying to take a very serious issue that Nova Scotians are being faced with and try to politicize it, Mr. Speaker, for some political gain. The reality of it is, Mr. Speaker,
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
The reality is, Mr. Speaker, negotiations are tough.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Tell him auditioning time is coming. He'll get a chance. He can audition soon. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is negotiations are always challenging and always tough, Mr. Speaker. Our healthcare providers recognize they're part of getting us back to fiscal health, and we're looking forward to finding a positive resolution to the negotiations taking place at the table.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, back in February, the Premier acknowledged that the campaign talk by the federal Liberals about changing the funding formula for health care transfers is unlikely to become a reality. He said, and I quote, "The funding formula on a per capita basis is going to be very difficult for any government to make substantive changes to," and I'll table that. Fast forward, Mr. Speaker, to the most recent meeting of the Atlantic Premiers, where the Premier emerged calling for a new deal with Ottawa on health care funding. So I asked the Premier if he feels changes to the federal funding formula is unlikely, what type of deal with Ottawa does he have in mind?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. What I said back when the formula was changed by the former Conservative government on a per capita basis, that it would be difficult for any province to go in and take $1 billion from Alberta, which that formula provided them. I don't know whether she suggested that the Premier of Alberta is prepared to give us $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. If she can negotiate that, we'd be more than happy to make that happen. What I said recently, Mr. Speaker, that would be the way to go to do that formula. But if that's not what they choose, then we need to look at any additional health care dollars, need to take in, Mr. Speaker, demographic, the social determinants of health, all of the issues, Mr. Speaker, aging population, chronic disease management, and any new funding coming into healthcare needs to reflect the needs of the parts of the regions that are experiencing those very things that we believe should be part of a healthcare formula.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, this government's handling of the health care budget could weaken any case the Premier may make for more money from Ottawa on health care. The government has made cuts to long-term care, cuts to emergency departments, cuts to physician services. Mr. Speaker, this government has underspent the hospital infrastructure budget by tens of millions of dollars. So I ask the Premier, is he at all concerned that his government's handling of the health budget will weaken its position to negotiate a new funding deal from Ottawa?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. She knows very well when she talks about the infrastructure budget, Mr. Speaker, all that money has been committed. Projects are moving down. We're making investments in healthcare infrastructure that our party ignored when they were in power. She should know very closely the investment we're making in her community in Dartmouth, Mr. Speaker, around Dartmouth General, the HI announcement we made, the community outpatient clinic we've talked about, the investment we're making in Windsor Hospital, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, we've done nothing but strengthen our position when it comes to negotiating with the national government. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, on the heels of national money flowing into this province, that government did nothing but turn around and invested in 7.5% pay raises while wait times were growing, Mr. Speaker. We're going to make sure that the investment Ottawa puts in this province lands at the feet of patients in this province to ensure that we have a system that reflects our ability to be able to deliver health care that Nova Scotians expect their government to deliver to them.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's one thing we can take away from this ongoing discussion on health funding, and that is that it will be quite some time before we see any changes to federal health transfers. In the meantime, health care in Nova Scotia is deteriorating under this government. The Premier has said they are tearing down walls in the health care system. Mr. Speaker, I would agree that there is indeed a demolition underway here. So I ask the Premier, given that the ER closures are up, wait times are up, and more Nova Scotians cannot find a family doctor, can he explain how his government's plan for health care is working?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the first time, Mr. Speaker, this province is looking at its health care system in totality, in a holistic way, Mr. Speaker. We're being able to invest to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we're putting the proper infrastructure in place. Instead of sitting paralyzed, being paralyzed by the opportunity like the former NDP government, Mr. Speaker, we've moved forward, put together a plan on how we improve the infrastructure in the province, Mr. Speaker. We've laid out a plan around collaborative practices, Mr. Speaker, that is rolling out, bringing healthcare providers into this system. We're going to continue to work with our clinicians across this province, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that Nova Scotians get access to healthcare in the community where they live, Mr. Speaker, in a timely manner, Mr. Speaker. And we're going to continue to work with those providers, regardless of the pessimism coming from the other side, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to do what we've been elected to do.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Negotiations with Doctors Nova Scotia has been going on for some time now. Last March, government retained an outside lawyer, Jack Graham, to lead this negotiation to a price tag of $150,000. In documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests, the government said Negotiating with doctors requires skill that's not available to government. But by December 2015, and of course I'll table that FOIPOP too, by December 2015, Mr. Graham had billed $150,000, and the amount government expected to pay Mr. Graham was revised to $450,000. So at a time when Nova Scotians are without a doctor, how can the Premier justify $450,000 to a lawyer?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I want to say to the honourable member that that funding is not all to the lawyer. Mr. Speaker, we have a team of people that are working on behalf of government. Mr. Speaker, we could do like previous governments have done, Mr. Speaker, and roll over, or we can make sure we stand up and defend taxpayers, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we get a fair deal. Mr. Speaker, that we get a deal that not only treats our healthcare professionals fair, Mr. Speaker, but also treats taxpayers fairly, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Institute of Health Information reported that in 2014, all provinces and territories except for PEI, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, that's three, all but those three had an increase in the number of doctors. I don't know why they think it's funny that we didn't have an increase in doctors in Nova Scotia when every other province except those three did. And I'm sure that thousands in Nova Scotia without a doctor, those included in Glace Bay and others, that the doctors wish this government would spend less on lawyers and more on recruiting doctors. Will the Premier commit to stop spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal advice from Liberal-friendly lawyers until the family doctor shortage is fixed?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. We continue to look for support outside professional expertise, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to delivering and negotiating on behalf of the citizens of the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to make sure that we have the appropriate team at the table negotiating on behalf of the citizens of this province to ensure that that deal not only treats our healthcare workers fairly, Mr. Speaker, but it also treats the Treasury of this province and all taxpayers fairly.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, doctors went public with their concern about the Health Authority's decision to restrict new licenses in the Central Region. They are claiming that this restriction is leading towards a staffing crisis in the short term. One doctor pointed to the frustration felt by new graduates and those who are about to retire. The doctor said, and I quote, "Most of them who are about to retire are no longer able to provide their patients with the assurances that they're going to be replaced, so they know that their patients are going to be orphaned within a matter of months," Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, can the Minister respond to the concerns of these doctors who are worried that there is a looming crisis around access to a family doctor, and I might say a crisis is upon us right now, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. When this line of questioning started a few weeks ago, there was at least 2 clinics that were identified as in need of a doctor. We know that in the last few weeks, recruitment of doctors for those clinics has now taken place, and they will be available to be covering patients that were seen by a doctor who has retired, and another case is out due to illness. So there is the contingency plan to look after the needs of those clinics.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the government doesn't seem to understand that the move towards collaborative care that the Premier and the Minister has talked about doesn't happen overnight. In the meantime, doctor shortages have now crept into the city, Mr. Speaker, something I know rural communities know full well the impact. One doctor said, and I quote, "We get hundreds of calls a day from desperate people looking for family doctors. It's breaking our hearts to turn them away, but we're full to capacity," Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that. The doctors are calling, Mr. Speaker, for a meeting with the Minister, along with a third party, Mr. Speaker, because they know how important and critical this issue is. So I ask the Minister, will he commit that there's a problem here and commit to meeting with those doctors immediately before this situation worsens, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite knows that even with a new group of doctors and residency now graduating, we know that getting them to commit to, for example, the current walk-in clinics in the city is no guarantee whatsoever. In fact, two residents representing the class of 2016 said there may be a few who would do a few shifts. So we know that we have to look at the whole issue here, and the Health Authority and several others are committed to meeting with GPs, walk-in clinics and clinicians here, and that meeting will be announced very shortly.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the doctor shortage around Nova Scotia and in particular in Cape Breton Island. And the Minister keeps touting how there's been 10 new doctors found for Sydney, and that's a good thing. But my question to him, has he really sat down and talked to the doctors that are providing service in the CBRM, had a discussion with them about the trials and tribulations that they are going through? What has he done in actual contact with the doctors in Cape Breton that are so concerned about the shortage there?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to say that I've met with quite a number of doctors in Cape Breton. I'd like to, in fact, relay for him in a house a not too distant meeting with the two doctors in Neils Harbour. And I said, you know, why haven't you been able to recruit here? The physician resource plan said that they could have 2.75 doctors. We know that recruiting a 0.75 is going to be impossible. I found that out on a Wednesday. On Thursday, I had the 0.75 changed to a full position, and we were able to recruit 2 doctors for Neils Harbour.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on the weekend, I am the leader of the official opposition and the member from Northside Westmount had an opportunity to meet with a number of doctors on Cape Breton Island. And we sat for 3 hours and listened to their concerns and what they were worried about in the healthcare system. Part of that meeting, Mr. Speaker, was the discussion about the number of doctors that have left and are planning to leave. Mr. Speaker, in the discussion, 15 doctors were identified as leaving from this point forward, not counting the ones that have already left. 15 doctors, specialists, family practice, and people that wanted to retire. But I shouldn't have to tell that to the minister because he probably knows that from his health authority. My question is, will he come to Sydney and meet with those doctors before the end of this month?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll be in Sydney in June, or I'll be in Cape Breton in June. We'll have a number of meetings with doctors and with people in communities in Cape Breton to address the doctor issue. What I do know is that recruitment so far this year is going very well, and I know that we'll be able to meet many of the needs of communities. I think it's a matter of identifying which practices, which communities that may be without a doctor, and we will address that in the coming month.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, parents at Kings County Academy have been very disappointed to learn that funding for the Grade 6 band program has been cut. Most parents will not be able to afford private musical instruction for their children with the cut in funding for the program. It is my understanding that the numbers were not declining for this program and that other schools do offer Grade 6 band in the area. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is, what would the Minister say to parents of Grade 6 students at KCA whose children will not have band instruction, even though other neighbouring schools do receive this instruction?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. And I'm certainly aware of the situation in the Valley, in particular in that school, where the board has made a decision that they would not continue to offer band to grade 6 students. It is, as I've said before, a board decision. I will say to the member that the funding that goes from the Department of Education to school boards with respect to music only includes band after grade 6. So band is not part of the funding to schools up to grade 6. It does begin in grade 7. But in many boards and in many schools and in many communities, students in grade 6 do get an opportunity for band. Sometimes that is the band auxiliary itself that's working with the parents and provides the funding for a band instructor. But formal instruction in band does not begin until grade 7.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister is very quick to place the responsibility at the feet of the school board, which made the ultimate decision. Despite this insistence, the Minister has to accept that the Department of Education sets the conditions for these decisions. Concerned parents from KCA will be hosting a meeting tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in New Miners to discuss the issue, and the Minister has been invited. My question for the Minister is this: will the Minister commit to attending the meeting with parents from KCA to hear their concerns tomorrow night?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member says that I'm quick to identify whose responsibility it is. I think it's important that everyone in this legislature knows whose responsibility it is, and that the funding that we provide Our grants to school boards has increased by $80 million this year, and I think that's significant. Unlike the NDP government, we are not cutting funding from school boards. We are increasing the funding to school boards.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that a healthy pregnancy leads to a healthy baby. Low-income women struggle during pregnancy to afford healthy food. Manitoba has found a way to ensure that all low-income women are able to carry a healthy baby to term. A recent report found that babies born to women who received an enhanced benefit did greater in terms of low birth weight and prematurity than a similar group born to low-income women who didn't. All this for the low cost of just $81 per month, compared to Nova Scotia's $51. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Community Services, is that given the success in Manitoba, will the Minister raise the maternal nutritional allowance to a rate equal or above Manitoba's?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. Very pleased to say that in the last budget we approved a $20 increase, the largest increase in the history of the program, across the board, and that would include not only pregnant mothers, but mothers, single parents, certainly persons with disabilities across the board, the largest increase ever in the program. I'm aware of the program in Manitoba. I'm encouraged by the work that I've been doing with my federal counterpart on the new child tax benefit that will be coming through in July, and I know that that will enhance both would-be mothers and mothers and single parents now who have children in Nova Scotia and make a considerable impact on their monthly income.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only time the maternal nutritional allowance has ever been increased was by my honourable colleague from Chester St. Margaret's, who raised this allowance by 75%, and I will table that. Since then, the maternal allowance, nutritional allowance, has remained frozen despite soaring costs for healthy fresh food over the last 2 years. Unfortunately, the proportion of low birth weights in Nova Scotia is the 4th highest in Canada at 6%. and that's despite our low birth rate. Mr. Speaker, given Nova Scotia's maternal outcomes, will the minister commit to raising the maternal nutritional allowance to reflect the current price of healthy food?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. One of the things that we were able to do in last year's budget, in addition to the substantial increase this year, was to raise the cap on the child tax benefit catchment area. So that actually brought 1,000 new families into that program with an increase to their child tax credit in Nova Scotia. I'm encouraged by the work that nonprofits do all through this province, including the new market that opened, not only my own riding, but the mobile market, and also with the farmers' tax credit, all which will enhance food security for low-income Nova Scotians in the province.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Acting Minister of Environment. We all know the importance that tidal energy might bring to Nova Scotia as a research and development and for the long-term energy needs. In fact, Emera plans to install their first turbine soon, and June 3rd, departure from Pictou is planned for the first turbine with installation a few weeks later. The berth holders have a requirement to have environmental monitoring plans approved by both DFO and Nova Scotia Environment. And Force announced their draft environmental monitoring rules, which also said they have to have their own plans. Yesterday, fishermen who called the Environment Department and DFO were told that no monitoring plans have yet been approved. When will the environmental monitoring plans for the first tidal turbines be approved?
The Honourable Acting Minister of the Environment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but with its reference to energy, I'll pass that to the Minister of Energy.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're very excited to see that the turbines are going to be deployed. This is a tremendous opportunity for Nova Scotia to be able to harness our tidal energy and produce a renewable, consistent form of energy for our province. Naturally, as I've pointed out in a op-ed that was published recently, this is being done at the same time with ultimate concern for the fisheries and for the habitat to ensure that there is protection there. These are demonstration turbines. There will be all the necessary monitoring that will take place with those turbines, and we'll continue to work with our federal partners and the local fishermen and all other interested parties.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I don't disagree with anything the Minister of Energy said. However, there is a requirement that the individual sites have monitoring plans in place. And yesterday, Nova Scotia Environment and DFO both said that they have not yet approved them. And yet, the first turbine is leaving the wharf in Pictou on June 3rd for a tentative scheduled installation of June 24th or 26th. I think the Minister can understand there are fishermen that are concerned about it. I agree with him on the potential. I'm just asking a very simple question. With the first scheduled turbines just a few weeks away and consultation still required on the installation and the environmental monitoring plans, what will happen if DFO and Nova Scotia Environment don't provide sign-off before the scheduled installation?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the tidal industry has tremendous opportunity for Nova Scotia, and I can tell you that the entire world is watching this technology, because we know that the tides in the Bay of Fundy are the strongest tides in the world, and therefore if we are able to harness those tides here, there's an opportunity for Nova Scotia companies to be able to export that knowledge throughout the world. And Mr. Speaker, as well, I've been a bit disappointed in the fact that I've not heard one of the members from Pictou County talk about the great employment opportunity that this has created, putting hundreds of people to work at the Pictou shipyard in building these turbines. Mr. Speaker, and there's more news that will be coming for that area as well, and it's unfortunate they don't share our optimism that we have for the economy in Pictou and the opportunity that the tidal industry will bring, but we will continue to work in promoting this industry and make sure to work with all of our stakeholders.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. Maybe the Minister of Energy can listen up too. He doesn't seem to be doing a great job of listening. But Portland City Council had a very public meeting late in April to discuss the Yarmouth Ferry contract. The City of Portland also then went ahead and posted the full contract between the City and Bay Ferries online, the full contract. Maybe they were boasting a little bit about the contract that they were able to sign, but sadly here in Nova Scotia, where taxpayers are paying and paying and paying, this government is reluctant to share important details of the contract with the good people of the province. So I'd like to ask the minister one more time, will the minister commit today to tell the people of the province how much the management fee that's being paid to Bay Ferries is?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to hand that question to the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, look, we've talked about this many times, both here in question period and estimates. There's competitive factors that are implicated with respect to this management fee, Mr. Speaker. That clause, that part of the contract, was the exact same clause that was part of the PC party's contract with Bay Ferries. So, Mr. Speaker, there's legitimacy, Mr. Speaker. This isn't about protecting anybody. This is the legitimacy of a competitive factor with respect to the management fees that are charged by a private sector operator, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the most open and transparent government, maybe not so much. I think at one point in time, members also used to ride up to this House on horseback. The minister is quite happy to drive in his car. Things change, Minister. We want to know what the management fee is, because low passenger numbers, taxpayers pay.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Pictou East has the floor.
Dock improvements, taxpayers pay. Vessel improvements, taxpayers pay. Management fee, taxpayers pay. Government's not interested in talking about that today. The question is, I'll ask another question. Is the CAT still going to sail on June 15 as advertised? And maybe you can give us a little glimpse as to how the reservations are. I've heard they're very poor. Maybe you can clear that for the House today.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is this. We support the Yarmouth Ferry, the Nova Scotia ferry service, Mr. Speaker. It's for the province. It's for all of us. It's an important part of a transportation link with the U.S. Mr. Speaker, this is what I can tell the member opposite, the entire House and all of Nova Scotians. We're moving in the right direction. Bay Ferries has a tremendous model. They put a lot of work into this to make sure this is done right. Every stakeholder, every part of the Nova Scotia ferry is moving in a positive manner. The communities are excited, Mr. Speaker, the region's excited. The only negativity now with the Nova Scotia ferry is coming from that member, that leader, and that party. We're moving on with Nova Scotians. They're leaving that cynicism behind, Mr. Speaker. Thank
you. The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, last week I requested the Minister provide a breakdown of the total contract value fees that are being paid to Newcastle. Newcastle, through Digby Pines and Liscombe Lodge, has been costing the taxpayers of Nova Scotia around $1.5 million per year. The taxpayers deserve to know how much that corporation is making through this contract. Since my question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is, since the Minister has already committed to providing this what should be public information already, will he commit to providing this information by the end of this session?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated to my colleague in a previous question period, I had no problem sharing that information with him or anyone else. I indicated at the time that those management fees have gone on for some 10 years now. When that party was in power, management fees are not abnormal in these processes. What I will tell my colleague is the management fees are the lowest they've ever been under our government, and before the end of this session I'll have that information from my colleague.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess I have to confess a little bit of confusion. On one hand, the Minister of Business is willing to disclose management fees, and that's great. We look forward to seeing him. On the other hand, the Minister of Transportation is not willing to disclose it. So which, I know this is the most transparent government ever, but which is the... on things that they choose to be transparent on. And my question is, which minister is for the Minister of Business? Which minister is following the policy of the government and being transparent? His department or the Minister of Transportation?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to recognize the good work that my colleague in the Department of Transportation is doing on behalf of all Nova Scotians.
Mr. Speaker, these are clearly two different industries. Contractual agreements vary from contract to contract and from industry to industry, Mr. Speaker. In these circumstances, as that member should be aware of, under his government, management fees existed then, management fees exist now, and management fees will exist into the future. I want to repeat for the benefit of this House and all Nova Scotians, the management fees associated to this particular contract are the lowest they've ever been in the history of this particular file. And I will commit, Mr. Speaker, to getting those numbers to my colleague before the end of this session.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to ask staff from the Department of Municipal Affairs about Section 93 of the Education Act, which authorizes the transfer of surplus schools back to municipalities. With the ongoing school review process, many rural municipalities are concerned about financial responsibility for aging schools being downloaded onto them, regardless of the potential liabilities associated with these buildings. And parents in Bridgeport are seeking a meeting with the Minister of Education as they seek to avert the closure of their school. So my question for the Minister of Education is this: is her department working with the Department of Municipal Affairs about this problem, and what is she doing about the concerns of municipalities caused by this section of the Education Act?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to stand and perhaps provide some clarification. We are respecting the decisions that have been made with respect to the return of schools after they are no longer used for public education. Pre-1982 schools go back to the municipality. In the case of Cape Breton, there are a couple of schools that will revert back to the church. And in the case of the P3 schools, if they are no longer used, they go back to the private partner.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, actually, the legislation does not provide municipalities with the ability to refuse to take control of surplus schools. And CBRM in particular is facing this closure of 17 schools, 15 of which say they are grudgingly accepting because of their legal obligation. And I will table that. So staff from the Department of Municipal Affairs has indicated that this has come up in their discussions with the municipalities. So I actually have a question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs, and this is, can he please provide an update on his department's efforts to address these concerns, since the Minister of Education doesn't seem to feel that it is appropriate for her to address it?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do take exception to the member's previous comment. The Minister of Education has done nothing but answer questions very clearly and directly in this House. And we all appreciate, Mr. Speaker, the great work that minister is doing in restoring the funding to our institutions that government cut when they were in power, Mr. Speaker. In relation to conversations with municipalities around surplus schools, that is part of the conversation that we've been engaged with through our partnership agreement, and that's a conversation that will continue, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister, or the Premier, rather. Yesterday, the member for Pictou East, with the assistance of Carolyn Fox, introduced a bill called Carly's Law. The Premier acknowledged the bravery and the heartbreak of the Cayley's family and friends. The Premier's former communications director took exception to the bill and made his feelings known on a Twitter. He likened the effort to seek help for kids with mental illness and giving the family a platform for change to garbage. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. Garbage. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is, does the Premier agree with the staff member that Cayley's Law is garbage?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Of course, all members of this House, I said this yesterday, the family coming forward to Mr. Speaker to talk about what's happened to their family and finding ways that we can better deal with ensuring that we are dealing with the multiple challenges that our children are facing as they grow through adolescence. We're going to continue to do that. We're with the work that we've been doing in our education system and investing year after year in Schools Plus programs. We've hired more psychologists this year. It's now providing, I think it's 29 across our school system, working with teachers to be able to identify early onset of mental illness, Mr. Speaker, and our children to be able to provide those supports, trying to work out with our clinicians to make sure that we're putting in place the community supports that we're required to help deal with this issue, Mr. Speaker. Every member of this House, every family across this province has, at some level, has had issues around mental illness and mental health challenges. We're now talking about them. The family came out yesterday in a very painful way, told us about their personal story, which is tragic, Mr. Speaker. No one in this House wants to ever experience what this family's experienced. We'll learn from what they've been able to do in other families about their experiences and what we can best do to put in those supports. And we're going to continue to work with our healthcare providers and families like the one that was here yesterday to ensure that we continue to do the best we can to provide supports for our children.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
I want to thank the Premier for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Carolyn Fox showed amazing courage yesterday by coming forward and telling her story. She did it in the hope of preventing another family from having to go through what she has gone through. She deserves our respect and our gratitude, Mr. Speaker. She does not deserve nasty Twitter remarks. So my question to the Premier is quite simple. Will the Premier distance himself from his staffer's remarks by passing Cayley's Law?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think any member of this House would know how I've conducted myself, that I would not associate myself with those remarks regardless of who presented them, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly. You know, our government is continuing to work with clinicians across this province to ensure that we have supports in place. We're working with our healthcare, our education partners to ensure that we're providing those supports. Yesterday, it was brought to the attention, actually, to a reporter who asked the question about the whole when a healthcare provider or an education provider is presented with private information but potentially could do harm without disclosing. Those are very difficult decisions that we have to make. I've asked our Department of Justice to look at that. Or are there ways that we can make sure that if someone is communicating one thing to a healthcare provider but not telling that to the parents and the parents don't know, is there a way for the healthcare provider to be able to provide that support, Mr. Speaker? Those are the things that we're going to continue to go on with. This is a tragedy, Mr. Speaker, any time that we lose a young Nova Scotian without being able to provide them with support. It's a tragedy for all of us. And at no time would I ever associate myself with any remarks, Mr. Speaker, regardless of what's said in this House or outside of this House, that would demean anyone who came forward to make sure that they tell their story to make things better, Mr. Speaker. That's what I hope all of us are in this House to do, is to make things better for Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, we see lots of money being spent on management fees, and it begs the question as to what value people of the province are getting for those fees. Last fall, the Premier gave his Deputy Minister of Planning and Priorities a personal services contract, Mr. Speaker, which was strange because I know the issue came up with the media about the recipient of this income having to pay less tax. And we know the government has spoken out against that in debates we've had about lowering the small business tax rate. However, Mr. Miller was no longer going to be a deputy minister, but was now taking the title of senior executive advisor, and we know he's getting $15,000 a month for this. Can the Premier explain what duties Mr. Miller performs for this?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, I want to say on behalf of all Nova Scotians how pleased I am that a person of Mr. Miller's caliber decided to leave the private sector and come and provide his expertise in the province. Mr. Miller's been working in priorities and planning, as the honourable member would know. All of the Treasury Board now has been moved out and put in the Department of Finance. Mr. Miller's responsibility is to continue to work on the growth strategy that we worked through the Ivany Commission and the One Nova Scotia Commission, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we continue to drive the priorities of that commission and this government and of all Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, and he's continuing to work with the Deputy to the Premier and to the Minister of Finance to continue to ensure that we we continue to provide stable finances to the province of Nova Scotia, that we continue to negotiate contracts, Mr. Speaker, that reflect our ability to pay, and that we continue to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that the services Nova Scotians expect in this province are done in an affordable, sustainable way.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is fine. We hope that there is good value being received for that, and I wonder if the Premier, Mr. Speaker, would be open to tabling Mr. Miller's invoices so that the public may see full description of a description of the work that he has been performing, so that is available to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Miller is on a contract, Mr. Speaker. I think that's been tabled. Surely they've gone over every contract government has had in the past period of time. But let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, at how fortunate we are that people provide. The Honourable Member asked me if I was the Premier. Absolutely. Mr. Speaker, you want to know that I'm the Premier, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to lead direction and move this province forward. We're not going to allow the union leaders, Mr. Speaker, to run this province. We're going to run it. We're not going to allow opposition to take us off track to providing good economic growth. We're not going to allow the opposition to move us, Mr. Speaker, keeping increasing our youth supports in this province. We're not going to allow the opposition to move us on the fact that private sector optimism is up, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to allow the opposition to take us off track to see population growth, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to allow the opposition to take us off track to see exports up, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to allow the opposition to distract us from moving this province forward, Mr. Speaker. That's leadership, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we've seen the Premier roll at the clock that tells him he should sit down. Stop him from keep going, Mr. Speaker. The first reported case of Zika virus in Nova Scotia was announced this week, Mr. Speaker. As the Deputy Chief Medical Officer explained, the risk of Zika to Nova Scotians is low. However, it's important to be adequately prepared for any outbreak. With the recent restructuring of the Department of Health, the levels of staff and resources are called into question. So, Mr. Speaker, with less staffing and resource capability in the Department of Health, can the Minister be assured that his department can adequately manage Zika or any other viral outbreak in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to say that Dr. Frank Atherton gave a very, very good account of the one case, and also the fact that we have a climate not likely to certainly bore that will have the virus active in our province. However, in terms of notifying physicians, clinical practitioners as to what they should look for, that information has gone out from the department, and the department is prepared not only in terms of Zika, but if there should be any kind of epidemic that needs to be contended with.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our province has had to deal with outbreaks before with H1N1 and other viral infections, Mr. Speaker. H1N1 showed us that the Department of Health requires a comprehensive plan and sufficient resources to be able to properly manage these viral diseases. A lot of that leadership, Mr. Speaker, came from the Minister of Health's own office. President Obama and the CDC, or the Centre for Disease Control, has warned the public that as temperatures begin to rise, mosquitoes that carry the Zika virus could potentially reach Maine, placing Nova Scotia at risk, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister tell the House if a plan is currently in place at the Department in the event more Zika cases are confirmed here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for presenting that important question to the legislature here today. What I can say is that we're fortunate to have the medical expertise and the Chief Medical Officer and his assistant to be able to lead any kind of plan to deal with an epidemic of any nature here in the province, or any kind of outbreak that may be seasonal. We have learned many lessons from H1N1, and now we're able to move very quickly as a province to contend with any medical incident that we may have to deal with.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, my question is for the Minister of Health. Yesterday, the Minister of Health announced the Halifax Hospice, and I will table that announcement, set to open December of 2017. And while I am sure the citizens of HRM are delighted and the hospice is very needed, I'll remind the Minister that the Valley Hospice fundraising has been finished 2 years ago with $4 million raised. My question for the Minister is this. What does the Minister say to the hard-working citizens of the Valley who completed their part in getting a hospice? Why are we being treated as second-class citizens here and still waiting for this hospice project to be announced?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can first tell the House is that during the last time his party was in government, the word hospice was not even written in the Department of Health and Wellness. We started at ground zero. We're just about there, and the member from Kingstown will certainly get an invitation.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to opposition business. The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can we call private members' public bills for second reading?
We'll now call private members' public bills for second reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll be going in rotation of 15 minutes. I'll get a schedule to the House Leader in a few moments. Could you please call Bill 167, the Fair Drug Pricing Act?
We'll now call Bill number 167, the Fair Drug Pricing Act. The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to rise and speak for a few moments on Bill 167. I think it's upon us when we see concerns in our community to make sure that we try to address them. It doesn't matter if you're in government, if you're in opposition parties, Mr. Speaker. We need to try to improve the process in which Nova Scotians receive services or how